Daliah
Should I start all over again?
is.
Okay. I'm going to start all over again. So my name is Daliah Setarah. I'm an attorney at the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, which is a nonprofit law firm that's existed for about 90 years in Los Angeles, and it provides free legal services for low-income persons in various different areas of the law. We have about 50 to 60 attorneys that specialize in these different areas of law. And one of the primary areas that we had been known for is working with immigrants in the field of asylum law and also victims of domestic violence who are in the United States as immigrants. In 2000, there was testimony before the US Congress that said that about 50 to 70,000 persons are brought into the United States every year for human trafficking. And as a result, the T visa was created to help law enforcement with the prosecution of human trafficking, but also to protect victims of human trafficking who are undocumented, who don't have immigration papers in the United States. Since then, those statistics have changed, and actually nobody really knows the exact number of human trafficking victims that are brought into the United States from abroad. Right now, the estimate is about 17,000, but nobody actually knows for sure. And so in 2000, we started working with human trafficking victims, and we were finally provided a grant when a big case broke out. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this case. That really, before this case broke out in Los Angeles, people would one-on-one work on human trafficking, but it wasn't really a coordinated response. Also in 2000, task forces were created as part of the Human Trafficking Victims Protection Act that created the T visa for immigration. It also created task forces, money for task forces, which were a forum for law enforcement, immigration, NGOs, social service providers, attorneys, local police to all come together to have a coordinated understanding and response for human trafficking. But in the beginning, nobody really knew what was happening. So in 2009, a big case broke in Los Angeles. And the way it started was, it was a case that started in Guatemala. And the client that I ended up representing was a girl who was 14 years old, and she was being molested by her stepfather. And when she told the mom that I'm being molested, the mom, instead of helping her, got angry with her and did not believe her. And the molestation continued, the sexual abuse continued, and so she ran away. And this is a girl from a small village from Guatemala that did not speak even proper Spanish. They spoke a local dialect. And so she escapes to the next town, and a woman says, "Hey, little girl, do you need work? Do you need food?" She says, "Yes." She goes, "Okay, come, you can work at my house as a babysitter or housekeeper, and I'll give you food." She says, "Okay." The next day, the lady says, "Well, if you want to make some extra money, you can come work in my cantina," which is kind of like a bar. And the girl says, "Okay, what do I have to do?" "All you have to do is pour beer for the men that come there and just talk to them, nothing else." She says, "Okay, I could do that." The next day, she goes to this bar cantina, and all of a sudden, there's a big raid. The local police come, they raid, take all the women that work there to the police station. This girl is so confused. She says, "What happened? What did I do wrong?" And they say, "Well, this is a brothel." She's from a small village. She has no idea what is a brothel, what is prostitution. And so the ladies explain it to her, and the madame, the owner of the bar, comes, pays the local police, and everybody gets released. And now she comes to my client and says, you now owe me 10,000 quetzales. How am I going to give you 10,000 quetzales? I have no money. Okay, you're going to have to work now as a prostitute. So for the next 2 years, this girl worked as a prostitute every day. And whenever she asked, well, how much more money do I have to pay off for these 10,000 quetzales? The lady would tell her, oh, you haven't paid it off yet because you broke a beer bottle. Oh, because, we charged you extra for food. We charged you for clothing. And after 2 years, the lady says to her, listen, do you want to once and for all finish your debt? She goes, yes. What do I have to do? Do you agree to go to Los Angeles and work there for about 3 months as a prostitute, and then you're free to go? We will arrange all your travels and everything. And she says, okay. They traffic her over the border, and now she's in Los Angeles, and for another 2 years, as soon as she gets there, and after 3 months she's not done, for another 2 years, every single day, whether she has her period or not, whether it's Christmas or not, Sunday or not, every single day, she has to serve about 15 men a day. And it's not just her, it's a group now of other girls that are with her. They're all in an apartment building in Los Angeles, and the trafficker arranges for them to meet different men in different hotels and different apartment buildings to have sex. One of the girls is gang raped by a local gang in Los Angeles in front of the other girls as a warning that if you dare to run away, this is what's going to happen to you. They take the girls to a witch doctor, and they say, if you run away, the witch is going to put a spell on you and on your families back in Central America. And these girls are from small villages, so witchcraft is something very normal for them. So all of them are very, very afraid. The way this story breaks is that the taxi driver who had been hired, at first he's thinking, these women, these are bad women, look, they're not proper women. But as he sees that the age of the girls that he's driving around is becoming younger and younger and younger, he starts thinking of his own teenage daughters, and he starts thinking, well, these are children. How can they be voluntarily doing this? And he doesn't know what to do because he's being paid by the trafficker, so he goes to the Guatemalan embassy to report the case. The Guatemalan embassy says, I don't know what you're talking about. This could not possibly be happening. And they ignore him. He doesn't know what to do, so he contacts one of the main Spanish networks, Telemundo, that broadcasts to the Spanish audience, a Spanish-speaking audience in Los Angeles. And they say, wow, this is a juicy story. We want to do something about this. And so they contact the FBI. The FBI, luckily, is part of the task force. And so the FBI brings the story to the task force. And now for the first time, we're trying to figure out, wow, there's about 24 victims. There's about 5 traffickers, 4 of them women, themselves Guatemalan, 1 of them a Mexican man. And how are we going to deal with this problem? And in the past, we thought that, a human trafficking victim, they're going to be so happy when we come forward and when we say, come, we're going to save you now. We're going to help you. So the FBI person goes to one of the victims and says, I'm with the FBI. I'm going to help you. And instead of coming forward, the girl says, I don't know what you're talking about. I want nothing to do with you. He comes back to the task force. What are we going to do? So we learned that so much psychological coercion has been going on, so much fear within these victims, that we need more assistance. And so the next time he went with a social worker, and somebody that spoke the local dialect of the girls, and was able to, that way, slowly create trust with the victim. As he created that trust, he was able to get her agreement to escape. They came up with an escape plan, and once she escaped and came forward, and the other victims saw that she actually is being helped, she's not being put in deportation proceedings, she's not being accused of being a criminal, the other victims also were able to come forward and were able to leave the trafficking situation. And this was one of the biggest cases that we had in Los Angeles. The 5 traffickers were prosecuted criminally in federal criminal court, and they each received a sentence of 35 to 45 years in prison for human trafficking. Now, the victims were asked to come forward as witnesses. And this presented another problem because, again, there was a lot of fear on the part of the victims. And we arranged so that I practice civil and immigration law, not criminal law, but different attorneys came forward and became the victim advocates, the attorneys for the victims, representing them as witnesses in the criminal court. And that included things like just making sure that they're okay, making sure that their rights are properly vindicated, because the prosecution usually is more interested in prosecuting the criminals rather than actually assisting the victims. So even though the criminal law in it has a provision for restitution, so that the victim gets paid the amount of money that she was exploited for, usually the prosecutors are not interested in that. So as we represented the victims as their advocates, we made sure that restitution was provided for. So since that case, we've learned a lot. So I want to briefly give you a little bit about overview of human trafficking, identification, and then some legal remedies for human trafficking victims in the United States. The definition of scope, as I mentioned, generally, human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal enterprise today. It ranks second to drug smuggling and the arms trade. And the United States is the #1 destination country. Los Angeles is one of the top 3 cities in the United States that is a receiving city for victims of human trafficking. Again, these statistics really are just estimates. They're not very accurate at all. But interestingly enough, in 2018, 60% of victims in California were actually United States citizens. 40 of them were foreign nationals. This is the breakdown for us in the last 2 years. We had about 60% victims that were sex trafficking, and 27% labor, and 13% both. This is just my foundation, not Los Angeles as a whole. And the balance changes depending on what type of a case breaks. So for example, recently we had a case from Thailand where about 42 men were trafficked into Los Angeles for labor trafficking, and so then the balance went more labor than sex trafficking. So it really just kind of depends on the type of case that's breaking. For us, the countries of origin, as I said, mostly United States citizens. Then we have a large human trafficking victim clients from Asia. That includes Korea, the Philippines, Thailand. We have, of course, a large segment from Mexico and Latin America. And we have a portion of clients from Africa, North Africa, East Africa, and also West Africa. What is human trafficking? So the perception versus reality. So we live in Los Angeles, Hollywood. So this is, I don't know if you guys know this movie, but it's a very popular movie that talks about an upper class Caucasian girl that goes traveling in Europe, and then she's seized and becomes a victim of human trafficking. And even though I'm sure that can happen, that really is not the face of human trafficking the way we see it, right? And so it's actually very dangerous when movies like this and this kind of sensationalism comes out, because then it distorts the reality of what human trafficking actually is. And then it inhibits proper identification of the true victims. So what we see in California a lot is we have a lot of farms, and there is a lot of exploitation of farm laborers. And these are persons that often are brought in from really all around the world to work in our fields, whether it's lettuce, tomatoes, tulip farms. And interestingly, we had, to show like how the image of human trafficking, there was a big raid in Central California of a tulip farm. You know tulips, the flowers? And so they had Dutch immigrants there who were teaching Californians how to raise tulip flowers, and we had immigrants from Central America. And so when immigration came to raid this farm, do you think that they apprehended any of the blonde Dutch people? No. They apprehended the colored persons who looked like they were undocumented immigrants. We have a big problem with narco traffickers from Central America and Mexico and in the United States. So there's a lot of, they used to be mainly in the drug trade, and now they have entered also into human trafficking because of how profitable it is. And so we see a lot of girls and boys being trafficked into the United States. This is an extreme example, but it is not rare, where the victims are actually branded by the local gangs. So they may have a tattoo inside their lips, as you see here, but we've also seen tattoos and branding on the bodies of victims. Massage and saunas are another place where there's human trafficking, mainly from Asia. And of course, domestic servitude. Here we have a picture of Filipino women who were victims of human trafficking. They were brought to the United States to be teachers at schools with troubled children. And after they were rescued, they became organizers, and they started speaking out about their problems and about the recruitment and about really just empowering other immigrant communities. We're going to cover the definition later, but it basically mirrors the Palermo definition of human trafficking. So we have the process of recruiting, harboring, moving, or obtaining a person. You have to have the means, which has to include force, fraud, and coercion. And you always have to have an end, which is either labor or commercial sex. If the victim is under the age of 18, and if it's a sex trafficking, they do not need to have the elements of force, fraud, and coercion, because it is presumed that a child under 18 cannot agree to commercial sex. Who are the US citizen victims? Predominantly, they're recruited children who have run away from home, either because of domestic violence at home, child abuse, sexual abuse. The foster care system, which is set up to protect children who are being abused at home, unfortunately is one of the prime breeding grounds for victims of human trafficking, especially girls of color. Black girls and Latina girls are most vulnerable to be recruited by traffickers. Also, we have a big group of LGBTQ youth that oftentimes is ostracized from their homes and becomes homeless, and they will then engage in survival sex, and they that way become victims of human trafficking. How about for the foreign national victims? How do they enter the United States? Yesterday, you already went over some of the ways in which people can enter a country to become victims. So in the United States, trafficking victims can enter either with legitimate visa documents. So for example, I have several clients that originally come from African countries such as Côte d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone, Eritrea, Somalia, Sudan, who are recruited by some of the other Arab countries. They want domestic servants, they want women to come take care of their children, and they oftentimes would like somebody who's also a Muslim. But when they come to work for them, they experience a lot of racism. So for example, my clients who are black have been told that, okay, you're not allowed, you're here a babysitter and you have to cook, but you're not allowed to touch my children. Here are gloves, you have to touch my children with gloves. You're not allowed to eat from the same plate. You have to have your own separate plates. And oftentimes in Los Angeles, we have Rodeo Drive. You may have heard of it. It's a exclusive shopping district. And so in the summers, a lot of the very wealthy families, especially from Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, come and they apply. They have to come with a visa, and they apply for their domestic servants, legally apply for them to come with a visa as domestic servants. And even at the US consulates, the domestic servants are given a pamphlet and are told, okay, in the United States, these are the laws. You have to be paid minimum wage. These are the dangers of human trafficking, for you to be aware of that. Do you have a contract? Oftentimes they say, yes, I have a contract. But once they come to the United States, everybody knows it's a joke if there is a contract, okay? Nobody then actually goes by the contract. And so a lot of them then become victims. The same exploitation that happened to them in the country that they were coming from, such as Saudi Arabia, now is happening in the United States. And in several situations, luckily my clients were able to escape the situation, either through another person from their home country that they were able to communicate with, or through a neighbor who was able to see that something strange is going on. And they were able to escape. Interestingly enough, when they were able to escape, law enforcement, we then contacted law enforcement to go after these families. But the families usually are very protected, and I haven't seen a case where actually there's been a prosecution of these families that come to sojourn in the United States. Another way is to come legit with fraudulent documents. So, for example, I had one client who there was a lot of talk for Côte d'Ivoire yesterday. The trafficker herself was somebody from Côte d'Ivoire who now had become a United States citizen and was quite a wealthy woman in Los Angeles. And so she wanted to bring a housekeeper from her home country. And she found a girl who did not know how to read and write, recruited her in her home country in Côte d'Ivoire, and gave her a fake French passport. And French passport, you don't have to have a visa to enter the United States. There's a visa waiver program. So she was able to bring her in very easily with these fraudulent documents that were not hers. And so now the client is in the United States. Nobody knows her real name. Nobody knows who she is, any information really about her, because the information immigration has is about the French person who's not her. Of course, a lot of persons enter without inspection. And we're going to go into the next slide. A lot of persons are smuggled into the United States. So what does that mean? To be smuggled means there is a business contract. Okay? Somebody from, let's say, Guatemala says, I want to come to the United States. The price right now is about $7,000 US. They pay that to a coyote, it's called, a smuggler, and it's a business transaction. The coyote then brings them across the border, and once they're in the United States, they're released and they're free to go. It's a business contract. However, what we're seeing more and more is that this type of smuggling can turn into human trafficking. Because what can happen, $7,000 is a lot of money. And so sometimes, let's say they're able to get their families to pay $5,000, so they owe $2,000 more. Or let's say they pay the $7,000, but in the end they say, oh, we incurred additional costs because we had to bribe more officers. So you owe another $1,000. And the way you're going to work this off is you have to come work here in the farm. What we're seeing a lot at the border between Mexico and the United States in San Diego is there's meth labs where they make illegal drugs, and they force some of these migrants to work in these meth labs. The women oftentimes are forced into prostitution. And that's a misconception because sometimes when there's a raid, sometimes the migrants believe that they themselves are guilty because they had originally agreed to illegally cross the border. But that is not so. There is protection for those who then become victims of human trafficking. Trafficking, on the other hand, always contains the elements of force, fraud, and coercion. It's involuntary, and it's a crime against a human being. It's not a crime against the border because it's not even necessary to cross any borders. In the interest of time, I'm gonna go to slide 22. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. I'm going to talk about something that has been interesting for us is the criminalization of, first of all, of migrants. Now with our new administration, there's been a lot more restrictions put on migrants who are in the United States undocumented. And the result of this has been really devastating to the community of migrants who are victims, especially victims of crime, victims of domestic violence, and victims of human trafficking, because there is much more fear to come forward and to report a crime. Where before we had assurances that if somebody comes forward and says that they're a victim of human trafficking, before there was really a pretty strong protection. Now, The protection has been decreased because even if a victim of trafficking comes forward, if they're not believed, they can be put in deportation proceedings and risk being deported. If their application is not granted, they risk being deported. Before this administration, there was an understanding, it wasn't part of the law, but it was an understanding that even if a client comes forward and even if their case is denied, that they're not going to be put in deportation proceedings. Now that has changed tremendously. And we see that in the amount of cases that are coming forward that have decreased, and also the amount of cases that get approval. Something positive, though, that I could talk about is the prostitution law. So in California, prostitution is a crime and it is illegal. And so if somebody gets caught for prostitution, they go to criminal court. In 2014, one of the judges who started seeing so many young girls, teenage girls, coming into this court and being treated like criminals, she said to herself, how can this be? How can all these teenage girls, very young girls, how can all these girls be voluntarily entering prostitution? There must be more to this story. And so she started investigating, and she started finding out that these children really are victims. They're victims of sexual abuse at home. They're victims of domestic violence. They're victims of human trafficking. And so they decided to create a special program called the STAR Court, a first step diversion program, which is really amazing because now when somebody is being brought in to the court as a prostitute, they're given a chance first not to be seen as a criminal, but for a year to undergo a program together with social workers, together with a shelter program, job training, a lot of therapy to address the causes for why this girl may have entered prostitution and trafficking. And we have seen a very big success with this. And for those victims who are foreign nationals, in addition, they're then referred to immigration attorneys who are able to assist them with their cases. So this is really unique in the United States, and other cities are trying to start modeling after this Los Angeles model. And I can't say that there's a 100% success rate. Some of the women go back into the life, and then they're seen as criminals after that. In California, these are some of the industries where we have identified trafficking. And again, you know, I'm here talking about trafficking. I've been doing this for many, many years, but even me and my colleagues, we're learning. Every day we're learning because human trafficking is such a hidden crime and it is still so unknown to us, even though we've been working with us. So these are some of the industries we've identified trafficking in: hotels and restaurants, sweatshops. Los Angeles has one of the largest industries, garment industries for making clothing, so we have sweatshops there. Private homes, the farms, construction industry. Okay, I have not much time. I have so much to talk about. Okay, how about what I want to talk about are just a few remedies. So in California, so as I talked about, is we have the task forces where there's a collaboration of law enforcement, immigration, FBI, NGOs working together to try to assist a victim, because we recognize that it takes all these different groups to make a little bit of an impact. In California, we just passed a new law where every hotel worker and every hotel and motel worker has to get a 20-minute training on what is human trafficking, because we're trying to see who are the people that can identify human trafficking. It can't just be law enforcement. It's too much of a burden. Who else can identify? Well, since we see it a lot in the hotels and restaurants, we need to train those persons. Transit workers for the buses and trains, airplanes. And now certain businesses have to post a warning about human trafficking at their doors or by the bathroom where everybody can see what is human trafficking. And it has the national human trafficking hotline number. It has a local human trafficking number and a text, because oftentimes we realize that a victim may not be able to call, may not be able to be speaking, but it's easier for them to text. So there's a number where they can text for help. Areas of law where human trafficking survivors need assistance in the legal field. So first of all, they need assistance in the criminal field when they're witnesses in a human trafficking case, as I already talked about with the case. We also have a brand new law in California, it's only about a year old, where if somebody can show that they're a victim of human trafficking, they can vacate or clean their criminal record. So a lot of times I have clients who have a large criminal record, whether it's prostitution, theft, all kinds of crimes. And if they can show that it's because of human trafficking, they're able to clean that record. In the civil arena, victims of human trafficking can come forward and file in a civil court to get reimbursed from the trafficker for the work that they've done and that they were not paid. So this could be wage and hours. It could be in torts where they also can get pain and suffering money. They can also, in the family law setting, obtain restraining orders against the trafficker in situations where, for example, the trafficker is actually married to the victim and maybe has children with her. She's able to, in family court, file for divorce, file for custody for the children, and also get a name change for protection. Lastly, in immigration, we have the triangle. So how does somebody go from, if you go to the triangle, it's slide 40, how does somebody go from being undocumented to becoming legal? So as you see on the very bottom, you have undocumented. The next step is there's several types of visa petitions. So it could be a regular family petition when everything is fine. When there's domestic violence, we have special provisions, the Violence Against Women's Act. For victims of human trafficking, we have something called the T visa for victims of human trafficking. We have a U visa also for victims of crime. We have political asylum as well. And I'm going to specifically just go over what are the elements, what does somebody have to prove in order to get a T visa. First, the person has to show that they're in the United States on account of the trafficking, so that they're here in the United States because of trafficking. Number two, that they were a victim either of commercial sex or of labor trafficking. They have to be willing to assist law enforcement in the investigation or prosecution of the crime. And this only requires actually coming forward to law enforcement and letting them know, I'm a victim and I'm willing to assist. If law enforcement needs more assistance, and if they refuse, this can inhibit them from obtaining a T visa. And they need to show that they would face extreme hardship if they had to return to their home country. The benefits of the T visa is they get 4 years of a work authorization where they can legally work. After a certain amount of time, they can apply for their green card, which is the next step in legalizing, making their legal status more stable in the United States, and it's a path to citizenship. Somebody who is a victim of trafficking can also get government benefits, federal government benefits, including food stamps, job training, cash benefits. And another benefit is that they can, once their petition is approved, they can also apply for their family members. And that can include, depending on their age, spouses, children, parents, and siblings. I'm just going to talk some of the challenges we've had have been with identification of victims, difficulties with law enforcement, recognizing trafficking. For example, if there's a raid, for them not to get translators to properly identify a victim of trafficking. The lack of understanding of the culture of human trafficking, mostly at the hands of law enforcement. Lack of supportive services. So even though, I talked about how many services we do have in California, it's still very, very, very limited. Even in a city like Los Angeles, we have one shelter for human trafficking victims and several shelters for victims of sex trafficking. But it really is not enough. And so oftentimes the victims get placed in domestic violence shelters or homeless shelters, which creates a whole host of other problems. Some of the successes we've seen is seeing how a client can move. I know yesterday there was a talk about the language of not using the word survivor, but I'm going to use it and say some of the success we do see is to see how somebody moves from being a victim and being disempowered to moving to being a survivor. Somebody who many of my clients become advocates themselves. They go out into the community, into the immigrant community. They speak out and talk about what has happened to them and really get empowered by being leaders themselves. And some of the other success is collaborating and the importance of collaborating with ethnic, community-based organizations, because nobody's going to trust somebody if they don't see that they have the language capability, that they have the cultural understanding of somebody who, of the victim culture. So I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.